President of the Women's Council on Energy and the Environment. Welcome. It is a delight to have all of you here with us on this sunny spring-like day, and we're in for a real treat this afternoon. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Angie Pastorek. She is the Program Director and Faculty at the Organizational Communications Graduate Program at the University of Kansas. Dr. Pastorek teaches graduate courses covering topics such as change management, decision-making, conflict management, professional writing and speaking skills, team development, and engaging workplace diversity. We were conferring just before we began here today, and it's clear that Dr. Pastorek was way ahead of everybody else in terms of some of the major themes and technologies that we are using now. Prior to joining the KU faculty in 2015, Dr. Pastorek worked for over 10 years developing and delivering training programs and communications resources for global companies such as Siemens Healthcare and Deloitte. I would also like to thank Olga Kakova for all of her efforts organizing and executing a fabulous Women in Leadership series, and for serving as chair in 2020 and 2021 of the Women in Leadership program at WCEE. Without further ado, Dr. Pastorek will speak on the topic of optimizing virtual communications, and I turn it over to Olga now. And thank you both, and thank you everyone for joining us here at WCEE's virtual day.
Well, we're so excited to welcome Dr. Pastorek, and go ahead, the floor is yours. We will follow up with some questions from the audience, which I would encourage people to use the raise your hand function to submit your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Olga, and thank you, Barbara, for the invitation to spend some time with you all today. And thank you for carving time out of your schedule to join us. I know we are all incredibly extra busy and probably spending more time than we already would want to on Zoom calls. So I appreciate your time and have planned an engaging presentation for us to start thinking about how we can even more fully leverage some of the functionalities that are currently available to create more engaging meeting and event experiences, something that we're all kind of hungry for, given that we are not able, many of us, to spend that quality time physically together working and getting to know one another. So in the midst of the pandemic and as a result of the pandemic, a big challenge that we're all facing in one way or another is the fact that our boundaries between our personal lives and our professional lives have really been blown open. And depending on where you are in your stage of life, as well as your stage of your career, you're balancing a whole heck of a lot of different things. You might be trying to work while having young children at home, doing virtual schooling. Conversely, you might be single and living alone and dealing with feelings of isolation. That's something that a lot of folks are struggling with that isn't getting quite as much attention as the more kind of full family household issues that others are dealing with. So again, just a full range of issues, and want to start by acknowledging that that we're all dealing with a lot, and thinking about how we can design more interactive meetings and events online can help kind of bridge that distance and close that gap that we're all kind of feeling. The other reason why thinking about how we can leverage some of the new technologies that are available to help close the gap and bring us together and help us not just share information in our online meetings, but really start to focus more on nurturing the social connection, which we tend to value so much from our in-person gatherings, is the fact that the pandemic-related stressors and crises have really amplified the formation of what's called communication overload. And I'm going to guess that you're all dealing with this, probably multiple of these dimensions here. So communication overload is a research concept that helps us kind of identify why it is that we are feeling especially overwhelmed and especially stressed as we adapt to this rapidly changing work environment. Again, where the personal and professional boundaries have really been blown open. So in the midst of all that, we're also adapting to new ways of working and connecting with colleagues, connecting with clients and partner organizations, really stimulating a whole new influx of communication methods, messages, tools. Many organizations have implemented new technologies. For example, at KU, we recently have started using Microsoft Teams, and it was thought that this would help us be able to connect more easily. It would centralize our web conferencing, our sharing of documents, our messaging each other. But what happened, and this is often the case, is that technology, while it may be helpful in the long run because of how it centralizes much of that communication, it becomes another form of work, another tool that we have to manage, another influx of messaging, another thing that we have to learn and troubleshoot and help others learn and troubleshoot. So that's just one example of how well-intentioned efforts in our organizations can actually contribute a little bit more, at least in the short term, to this feeling of communication overload. In general, other contributions to communication overload are message quality. So receiving messages that aren't clearly written, or it's not clear what's needed from you. Sorting through those kind of one big blocks of text messages where it's not quite clear what the ask or what the need is. Using many technologies, as I mentioned, our organizations, again, often implement new technologies, but the old ones never really go away, right? So we end up having to learn and integrate this new technology and help our teams do the same. Certainly as we move up the chain to management and leadership, feeling pressured for decisions, right? I'm the manager, I'm the leader, I've got to figure this out and help my team. Similarly, number 4, being overwhelmed with information, just the sheer amount of details that we're trying to sort through on a given day. Receiving many messages across different methods. Number 6, having many distractions. Again, we're not sitting in the office, many of us anymore, right? We are at home where we have partners and pets and young children potentially requiring our time. And so that's just one more distraction that we have. And then we may finally feel responsible to respond to a whole host of inquiries that are work-related and non-work-related. My partner was working from home with me yesterday, actually, and I was definitely not as productive as I usually am because he was asking me for some home-related questions and business that we had to take care of. So again, I mention all of these things to think about the fact that we're dealing with a lot. So how can we most strategically leverage the technology for good? When we're planning meetings, when we're planning events, how can we help our participants kind of step away from all of these distractions, but also be mindful that we don't want to further overwhelm people with lots of options. So today, through the body of this presentation, I'll provide some kind of best practices and tips for thinking about how you can strategically use some of these technologies, particularly within web conferencing platforms like Zoom, to bring people together, to help them connect and have conversation, share information, share resources, and continue building those relationships like we typically do in our in-person events. Before we move on, I want to share our first polling question with you to get a feel for regarding these sources of communication overload. What do you feel is currently your personal biggest form of communication overload right now? So you can go ahead and click on the response that matches your experience. And the polling feature within Zoom is one of the interactive features that we'll be talking about today. If you happen to use a different web conferencing platform, there are also separate tools like Kahoot, K-A-H-O-O-T, that you can use to bring polling into both your online events and your in-person events, actually. So Kahoot is a great resource if the web conferencing platform that your workplace uses does not include a polling feature. But this is great for engagement. I'll be able to hear as I wait a couple more seconds to make sure everyone has an opportunity to participate. You'll be able to see the results, and this can be a great conversation starter, either verbally or through the chat. So let's go ahead and take a look. So the number one response at 31% was receiving many messages. So just the sheer volume of messages. So this is our standard stressor, right? This is actually not something that's new, probably for most of us to the pandemic, but it's probably amplified even more because again, people are having more questions and needing more support as they adapt to this new way of working and not being able to have those quick face-to-face conversations in the office. It looks like the second most popular response was having many distractions, which again is not surprising. We now not only have our work-related distractions of incoming emails and text messages. Again, we also have additional distractions coming from our physical environments for many of us, not all of us. If we're facing that isolation, working from home alone, I want to acknowledge that as well. So that was our first polling question. We'll have another one at the end. Stop sharing there. So again, to summarize, again, how can we make the most of our online events to leverage these technologies and features like the polling question to help us not only share information and insights, right? That's one of the main reasons we want to bring a diverse group of people together. But number two, especially again, in the midst of the pandemic, to help each other authentically connect with people who share your experiences and challenges or who can provide insight and guidance, right? And so there are these tools within web conferencing platforms and other resources as well to help us do that. By focusing on how can we help people connect and create conversation, we're helping each other. That can be a huge source of a resource for helping us overcome that sense of isolation when we are purposefully and strategically connecting, either in a meeting or even one-on-one to check in with each other and say, how's it going? How can I help? What's one thing I can do to help you today? That goes a long way to meet our emotional needs in addition to our informational needs these days. And then of course, we also want to make sure that we're moving ideas and projects forward. So as you look at these 4 goals of events, again, just think about how can I, as I'm planning the agenda and flow of my meeting, use some of the tools we'll be talking about here in a little bit to balance delivering information that people absolutely need, but also creating space for relationship building and interaction amongst participants as well. Why does this matter? In addition to communication overload, one more piece of research-oriented content that I want to share with you before we get into the practical tips and strategies is something called the virtual distance model. This was created by a couple of researchers, one of whom works for Microsoft in their research unit and one who works in the corporate world. And so together they did research via interviews and surveys with several thousand individuals across many different companies and heard stories and collected data, statistical data around what people were really struggling with. And they came up with these 3 themes, these forms of distance, which tend to become amplified when we have to rely on electronic communication. Interestingly, this research was first done back in 2008. They recently published in 2019 an updated version of this. But even back in their original research, they found that this virtual distance existed even when people worked together in the same physical location, if they were over-relying on email communication at the time. So it really helped back in its first phase, help us understand the issues and challenges that can come to the fore when we're relying on technology too much rather than focusing on this face-to-face interaction and collaboration, which we can now do a little bit of via web conferencing as well. So these 3 forms of distance that are amplified by over-reliance on electronic communication, the one that the researchers found had the most negative impact on organizational commitment, team performance, project outcomes, employee morale was this affinity distance. And this is based on not knowing one another truly, not having the opportunity to work together. Organizations that amplify or focus too much on hierarchy and default to things like organizational tenure and job title, rather than bringing people together on equal footing to say, let's share our experiences, our insights to solve this problem. So again, think about how we might do that virtually in these types of spaces as well. So minimizing that social distance to, again, help people really get to know each other and appreciate what each person brings to the table. The second form of distance was operational distance. This one is especially important during the pandemic. Important to keep in mind that the diversity of your participants in an online meeting, that people might not have great quality internet service at their home, right? If they have limited financial resources, they may not be able to afford in-home internet access. You might have folks that are maybe planning to log on to Zoom for the very first time. So it's important to keep in mind as you're planning engagement to provide clear instructions as you're facilitating on how to use the tools, maybe provide some upfront information for people. If you know that a good chunk of the folks are newer to this technology, you could send out some basic instructions as part of the agenda as well. So just being sensitive to the fact that people have different access and different levels of experience with these types of technologies. And then the third issue here, which is not new or not due exclusively to the use of technology, is physical distance. So geographic distance, working with folks from different states, from across the globe, right? You have cultural differences, time zone differences. I know that many of you are already grappling with those issues in the work that you do. And then think about how that also kind of is compiled with affinity distance and operational distance as well. So just wanted to give you this kind of three-part framework and kind of some language that can be helpful sometimes for initiating these conversations. If you're maybe the one that wants to push to think a little bit more strategically and purposefully about how to use technology to be more inclusive, to be more engaging, that these are the forms of distance. And again, particularly affinity distance that we want to focus on closing by making our meetings more interactive, but also being mindful of differences in relation to operational distance. And one last piece of content here, then I'll stop and pause for questions before we get into the practical tips and strategies piece. From a communication standpoint, and my field of teaching and research is communication studies and technology specifically. And so kind of a basic theory that we have within the communication studies field is that there are lean media and there are rich media, and they're on a continuum. They're certainly continuing to evolve. We could probably build out a couple of more circles on this now with all the new technologies that are consistently becoming available. But this theory basically tells us that the more rich a media is, so the ones on the right-hand side of this continuum, the more cues that are available, right? So if we are in a web conference or having a face-to-face conversation, we can see eye contact, facial expression if someone is confused or maybe frustrated or maybe angry about what's happening or what's being discussed, right? We can adapt more in real time. So that really helps us build more authentic, effective relationships, rather than, again, over-relying on what might be really convenient forms of communication for us, email and texting, but we can't see those nonverbal cues, right, which can make conflict more prevalent or more likely to occur. So whenever possible, again, the more rich a media we can provide, it allows for that synchronous in real-time exchange of not only words and information, but also those nonverbal cues, which is really important for building relationships. Okay, so I want to definitely pause here and see if we have any questions about that material. Again, just some framework, some language. I often hear from my students in my graduate courses at KU that sometimes just having a name for some of these things that we experience but don't necessarily have language for, again, can be really helpful for opening up conversation with coworkers and colleagues. Any questions before we get started? Again, you can pop them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself as well and ask verbally.
May I ask a question? It's Barbara Tyron.
Yeah, Barbara, yes.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's so wonderful. You've done all this work way ahead of when we entered this global pandemic. So there's a strong academic foundation and obviously a huge need to understand this better now. My question is, there seem to be a lot of communication technologies available. You mentioned email, chat, Teams, Slack. And it seems to me that none of them really afford a better, or as you called it, richer media experience than another. I mean, they're all forms of written communication. Is it, first of all, is that correct? And secondly, isn't it more efficient just to have everybody using one technology rather than multiple ones?
Yes, yes. So the ultimate answer to your last question, I would say yes. Ideally, when we can get everybody on the same tool, that helps reduce some of the operational distance, right? Where people are saying, wait, I haven't used that tool, or I'm not as familiar because we use tool X, right? So that is definitely ideal. I would agree also that many of the tools that you mentioned, right, they're not necessarily giving us new ways of communicating.
Exactly.
It's a little bit different. It might have some interesting kind of tangential features that are interesting and fun, but in the end, is it really helping us improve and enhance our ability to build relationships? I will say things like Slack, when they first came out, it got a lot of kudos because it did allow people to more quickly share attachments as well as information kind of in real time. So people could have real-time conversations across physical distance. So that was an advantage of that tool, but it quickly became overwhelming in many instances because, again, people were learning to use that and keep up with that real-time communication tool in addition to email, in addition to phone calls, in addition to chat. So it seems like that is one tool that was incredibly popular 3 or 4 years ago that seems to be waning just a little bit, I think, because it's kind of fallen into, okay, this is just another tool, right? So now we're going to wait for the next hot new thing, which seems to be Microsoft Teams right now. So there's certainly financial incentives to continue introducing new tools. Certainly individuals within organizations will, influential individuals will say, we need to do this because it's going to help us be more efficient or more effective communicators. They're really into it. They like it, right? But it does just become more work oftentimes. And so ideally, organizations could say, if we introduce this new tool, which one or two other tools might we look at phasing out over time so that we're centralizing how we're communicating.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, hey, hi, I had a question.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Hi, my name's Evelyn. It's cool that you mentioned Microsoft Teams because they're just talking about a whole bunch of tools that just come out through Ignite. So that'll be interesting. I'm all for getting it down to just one effective tool and, not Zoom, Skype, and Teams, which is how our office started, but got it down to Teams. And I guess you get to the subject later on, but what you mentioned rich media and being able to
Evelyn, it seems that we're losing you to your internet connection.
What people can and how you use that case.
I'm sorry, Evelyn, it looks like your internet connection was cutting out. Are you able to text your question and I can try and answer it that way? And while we wait for that question, and Olga, if you could monitor that for me to see if we get
Yeah, we'll do it.
Any other question before we move into the technical tips? All right, those first couple were really helpful. So we'll go ahead and move into some of these other tips and strategies, and we'll continue to practice with a couple as well. So in your full session, in your full Zoom meeting, right, you can definitely use the chat feature. Some interesting ways that I've seen people use this, in addition to, as I've been doing here, calling on people to use the chat if you have any general questions. You can also pose a question and ask every participant to post a response. So for example, what's the biggest positive outcome for you in terms of having the flexibility to work from home? if you wanted to do kind of a engaging warm-up question in a meeting like this, and then everybody can hit enter and we would see all the answers in the chat. I will say that works well for kind of small to mid-sized meetings. If you've got 50 or 100 people in the group, it's going to be maybe too much to try and kind of scroll through and read. But if you've got a small group, maybe up to the size that we have here today, that's something that can work. So again, just asking a question and asking every participant to post their response in chat. It's a helpful way to see what other people are thinking or feeling about a particular issue. We also have the reaction buttons, depending on what, let me pause here and see. If we go, oh, it looks like we don't have, hang on. We don't have everybody on view. So if we had what I call the Brady Bunch view where we could see everybody's faces, you will also typically have reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen. So the hand clap or the hand wave or the thumbs up. That's a great way to, if you're celebrating someone for their contribution or accomplishment, that everyone else on the call, like Olga's doing for us right now, you can do the hand clap or the smile or the thumbs up. I've seen that. We use that a lot when we have our all campus meetings at the Edwards campus of KU. And it's just a nice way to let people know that we're listening and want to participate in congratulating them as well. Number 3 is that the chat feature in particular can be an open space for participants to converse with one another during the session. So this happens a lot in my graduate courses, for example. So when you have groups that are meeting regularly, maybe your weekly staff meeting, for example, and a topic comes up that people have resources to share or questions about, they can either message the entire group or they can message one person, right? You can choose the person that you want to send your chat with. So there can be very active conversations in the chat. When I first started seeing this happening in my graduate courses, I was a little concerned. I thought people aren't paying attention to the information that I'm providing. But I quickly realized that they were having really important side conversations and sharing links with each other, in addition to pretty quickly turning back to our group conversation. So the chat can be a great place for that information sharing and connecting. And then certainly both participants and moderators can share links to resources with participants in real time. So we're going to practice with that here in just a little bit as well, that as a participant or a moderator, either myself or Olga, again, could put something in chat for everybody to take a quick look at or actually log into. I was on a session like this a couple of weeks ago where the presenter had created a Padlet, which is an online kind of visual board where people can post images or write comments. And so she was having people engage that way. So there's a whole host of additional tools that you can kind of start to research and ask around in terms of how are people leveraging those additional types of technologies. I will say you want to be, again, strategic about this. You don't want to overload people, particularly people that are newer to participating in a main meeting and then integrating additional tools. So you want to get a feel for how comfortable people are with those additional technologies. But integrating 1 or 2 of these types of features is a great way to help people interact and feel more connected. Breakout rooms are a great option if you have a big problem that you're trying to solve and you've got all the right people in your meeting, right? You also have several options for how you can set up meeting rooms in Zoom. And so this is when you first click on the meeting room feature. You can choose to let Zoom set up your meetings for you. So if you say you want 3 separate breakout groups of 5, it will take the total people that you have and put them in that number of groups. So that's a great way to connect people who may not have worked together before, don't know each other, just for that social connection across a wide range of people. So that's why you might choose the automatic option. If you have people that you strategically want to put together in a breakout room, right? So the 3 or 5 folks can get together and share their insights, share their questions because they all have a similar challenge. Or you want to be strategic and do a mix of folks in terms of the organizations they work for or their position on the hierarchy, right? You can create conversation by strategically structuring who's in each group. Conversely, and I've done this as well, there might be topics where you want to separate people by group or by level, right? So you want to have your more frontline folks in a kind of a safe space where they can kind of share or maybe vent a little bit. And then maybe you want to have your management and leadership folks in their own breakout group as well. So they can have honest conversations with each other about the topic. And then when you bring everybody back into the main room, each group will feel a little bit more safe and secure in that they've kind of coalesce with like-minded folks and feel a little bit more courageous sharing maybe some difficult insights or suggestions they might not feel safe sharing just on their own. So again, thinking strategically about how you want to use breakout groups can be really helpful. And then the third feature here is you can let people choose their breakout room. So I was in a meeting, another meeting, I'm in a lot of Zoom meetings, as I'm sure a lot of you are these days, where the moderator let us choose. So they set up, let the participants choose their group. And there were 3 topics related to the agenda for the meeting, and we were allowed to pick which topic we wanted to talk about with, and then we didn't know who we'd be in the group with, but it was everybody who was interested in that topic. So again, just 3 options for thinking about how you set up your breakout groups for stimulating connection and relationship between the right people, the most meaningful connections for those folks. Another quick tip here is to be strategic with the amount of time that you give groups. I know you may have had the experience, as I know I have, where the conversation's really just getting started and then, oh, the breakout room closes and we're back in the big group. So make sure to build in time for rapport building, clarifying instructions. What are we supposed to be doing here? Build that into your time in addition to however much time folks might need for reviewing a document that you've posted online or clarifying instructions. Breakout group structure 2 to 3 is ideal so that everyone is engaged and not just feeling that they might be able to sit it out. You can have larger groups. Typically, though, you want to have a facilitator, a designated facilitator that you work with in advance, maybe pose some questions or structure an activity, and they're actually facilitating, much like we might bring in an outside facilitator for a regular in-person meeting. I've also used facilitators when I'm doing training in this type of setting on diversity, equity, inclusion. I have some corporate training clients, and so those are some difficult conversations oftentimes. And so in that case, I always bring in a handful of trained facilitators that work with me, and I put them in the breakout rooms to help guide that conversation, right? And keep things open, but also making sure that it's staying a healthy discussion, but also challenging for folks. Number 2, this is a big one, to provide clear documented instructions for any breakout activities that you are giving. So what you can do here, again, is post the instructions either on a slide and have people take a picture of the instructions with their camera, or use a screenshot software like Snagit or the snipping tool, it's called, that comes actually as part of our laptops if you have a regular PC. I'm not sure what the equivalent might be in Apple, but it's called the snipping tool, and you can quickly take a screenshot or again a picture with your camera to make sure you've got the instructions right to help your breakout group go as smoothly as possible. In terms of specific activities, mini case studies can work. So if there's a problem that you're trying to solve, kind of taking it outside of the immediate context and posing a hypothetical situation that's very similar. I do this all the time in my graduate courses, and it really helps people think about issues that they're personally dealing with at work or in their professional lives, but maybe they don't want to talk about their personal feelings. By creating this kind of case study where the characters are having dialogue and navigating similar situations, that's something that can really get people talking and problem solving. Certainly we can just keep the conversation more open and have folks share personal experiences, focus on brainstorming new ideas, and tackling big questions. And as I mentioned before, using a facilitator or appointing a facilitator that's part of your team is definitely a good choice for more difficult topics, or just a topic that you feel is maybe currently a hot topic in your organization, so that conversation can stay moving in the right direction. Here you also see a quote from Dr. Amy Edmondson, who is a professor of organizational behavior at Harvard, talking about what we've been talking about here so far, which is ultimately the power of social connection and validation that breakout rooms can provide when we plan them strategically and effectively, right? It becomes this psychologically safe space. And she has a whole research agenda around psychological safety and its benefits to teams and organizations. So allowing people to test their ideas and build relationships in these smaller breakout groups makes it easier for them to share ideas and insights, again, that they might feel, maybe I'm the only one, but then I realize I'm not the only one with this concern or this idea. So once I'm validated in that way, more comfortable sharing it with the larger group. Talked about that. The other thing that we can do, and we're actually going to do this here in just a second, is that you can share a link to an external document as a way to get people engaged. It's a little bit, it's kind of next level in addition to using the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to try this. And I encourage you to, and we're going to, at the end, I'll ask you what's one or two things that you're going to try or try to do differently as a result of what we've talked about today. So I will say I am experimenting here with you all. I've done this a couple of times in the past, but we will see how it goes here. I did test this out. So let me share my screen. Oh, actually, let me hit in the chat. Hopefully you all, if you click on your chat button at the bottom of your screen, at the top of the screen, depending on your computer, you should see the link to this document. So if you'll click on that link, you should be able to type in your ideas regarding an engagement strategy that you've used with your own online meetings. And I think this is a new thing in Google Docs where we all get these interesting names like anonymous duck and anonymous chinchilla. So Google's trying to help make these online meetings fun as well. So this is a great way, right, in real time. If you've had to deliver a bit of content, you want to get people involved, we can do this here. The nice thing is you can then save this document, right, as a facilitator, and you have this information. So if you were asking a question related to a specific project challenge or wanted to collect ideas from people in relation to that, you would then be able to save this document. So survey questions, virtual whiteboarding tools, breakout rooms, yes. Great, so we can see that conversation happening. Excellent. Anonymous jackal, I think that might be my favorite that I've seen so far. So again, great way to kind of stimulate some interaction. And again, you as the facilitator can actually save this document and potentially then share it with all the participants afterwards as well to kind of document key takeaways, next action steps, whatever it is that you will have captured on this document. So I'm going to go ahead and bring us back together. Interview style, host guest, yep, absolutely. So more of a panel type of conversation, great. All right, so let me go back to our PowerPoint. Other thing that I want to mention, options for accommodations. So very recently, if you have the most updated version of Zoom, you can pin a speaker and you can actually pin yourself. And so I just pinned myself. So you see, I think you probably all see this white pin next to my name now. So if we had multiple speakers, I would always still be the primary speaker. So you could see me as well as other primary speakers. So this can work well if you have translators or interpreters for people that need those services during your meeting. We actually use this feature for this reason in many actually all of our meetings at the KU Edwards campus, because we now have a new American Sign Language program, and our faculty are either deaf or hard of hearing. And so we have to make sure that we have pinned in every meeting the primary speaker and then also the translator or interpreter who is providing that service in real time, so that our faculty who need that service can participate fully in the meeting. So that's been a big point of progress for us as an organization, that we are more mindful of that than we used to be, quite honestly. So similarly, you can have closed captioning. You can also, you have the option if you're recording your meetings. Zoom has recently integrated this feature as well, where when you get the recording email, there's a recording and there's a recording with closed captioning. So that is the version of the recording that I typically will always send out now. It's also just helpful if people, for anyone who wants to just quickly read the transcript rather than watching the video. Closed captioning can also be helpful for folks that have technology issues. So I had activated closed captioning on some of my classes last semester because I had a couple of students that lived out more in rural Kansas and they didn't have the best internet connection where they were. So even if the video or the audio cut out in our conversation, they could still track with the closed captioning what the conversation was. And that was not something that I had even thought of before we did that. So that's just another benefit there. And then certainly making recordings and transcripts available is helpful too. So as we've talked about those ideas for interaction, also just want to be mindful of equality versus equity, right? So treating everyone the same would be just having these types of meetings without these types of considerations, which would be on the left, right? Everyone technically has access, but we also want to be mindful of accommodations and also how we plan for interaction in a way that addresses equity related concerns. So the closed captioning and the pinning, making sure that you are aware in advance of anyone on the call who might need those services so that everyone can fully participate. General planning considerations overall, just to kind of recap a little bit here. Plan for engagement, but don't overwhelm people. So a good rule of thumb is, what are one or two of these types of tools that I can integrate into my meetings? And again, we've been talking about large events mostly today, but you can certainly do the same thing with your team meetings, your weekly regular meetings. Absolutely start planning for how you might be more strategic in engaging folks and creating those connections. Number two, minimize stress for yourself. Try one new thing at a time. So you might be thinking, oh, I can do all of this, but just to make it easy for yourself, pick one new thing maybe that you'll start trying or revisit. Maybe you tried it once and it didn't go that great, but you're going to, dig back in and try it again. And then number three, I'm a big fan of this if you're still feeling nervous. And again, just to make sure it goes smoothly, you can test new features with a couple of people before your big meeting. So Olga and I touched base before our meeting today, just to make sure that we had everything set up and that things would run smoothly. So find a couple colleagues that are willing to be your guinea pigs and you can kind of test things out together. So last question, polling question before we open it up for your questions again. Let me activate this. Which online meeting feature will you try for the first time or try using in a different way? You can check all that apply here. And we've included another option because I realize that you might be using a different web conferencing software that has some features that you've been meaning to try, but maybe just haven't had the time. And so you're thinking, I'm going to go ahead and try that next time. We'll wait just a few more seconds here. Responses are rolling in. And if you're curious about the polling questions, you can set these up in advance. If you go to your Zoom dashboard when you're first setting up your meeting, towards the bottom of that setup, there's a small, I think it's a button or a tab where you can add a poll or multiple polls. Okay, let's see what we have here. We have a tie. So a third of you said you're going to try polling questions, and a third of you said you're going to try the online document that people can co-create in real time during the meetings, and then you can then save and also potentially share with participants as a takeaway. So that's fantastic. And a couple of you are saying, I actually have some other ideas as well. So that's fantastic to see too. Okay, so the last thing that I want to share with you before we open up for questions is just a brief video, and this is certainly something else that you can integrate into your meetings to kind of summarize things in a different way. So this is Priya Parker. She does conflict and mediation management, and she's also written a book on a related topic here. And in this TED Talk, she summarizes 3 steps to turning everyday get-togethers into transformative gatherings. And you can see the list of the 3 items that she talks about. For our purposes here, I'm going to play the last about 2.5 minutes of her talk that focuses on these temporary alternative pop-up rules that really free us from just going along with the typical structure of meetings and gatherings, and instead open up new possibilities. So I'm going to pop over. Okay, and with that, I want to open it up for questions. And I also have one more slide that I'll share while we're waiting for questions with some resources for you.
Please raise your hands too. That way we can call on you and we can facilitate to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask their question. Thank you so much, Angie. This was fantastic. And I loved how many different things you integrated in your presentation. Google Docs, polling, you had a video. It's so impressive.
Thank you. And again, while we wait for those questions, some free resources. I also facilitate, along with some faculty colleagues, a series of free monthly, what we call Lincoln Learns, which are very similar to our event here today, 1-hour web conferences that are facilitated by myself or another faculty member or qualified guest speaker on the topic. So you can see where to register on the KU Edwards website. And then you can certainly email me. I have my contact information here at the bottom as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much, Angie. And it looks like we do have a question from Karen. Go ahead.
Yep, I'll just pop on video since that seems to be a little bit more interactive. I actually don't have a question, but I do have like a lessons learned that I have done with, because I have meetings with, sometimes 100 people. It's always good to have a colleague on your meeting to deal with the technical background stuff, like letting people into the room. People aren't always on time, and sometimes you have to let individuals in the room. And if you're speaking, it disrupts you and you lose your train of thought and you lose your audience. So I've seen that to have another colleague that you trust, they can also mute people when there's some background noise, because that's also, distracting. And if I have to stop what I'm saying and look for who's talking and mute them, it really does, interrupt the flow and you lose your audience. So that's just one of the lessons learned that I picked up that I think helps a lot with engagement. So you're focused on the engagement aspect and someone else is looking at the technical side of things.
Yes, thank you, Karen. That's a fantastic tip. Absolutely. Great.
Thank you. Angie, I have a question for you as well. And thank you, Karen. This is such a great point to make. I completely agree. And I think for teams who are not big enough to have their own IT or events or AV department, just, like you said, asking a colleague to just help out with that is really, really fantastic. Angie, how do you gracefully recover out of situations when things don't go as planned, as we've all probably experienced at some point in the last year or so? What are some tips on just saying, okay, well, that did not go as well as it could have? How do you move on gracefully and, turn it into a good moment?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. And I will say overall, I think that's one positive that's come out of the pandemic situation is that we are prone to give each other a little bit more grace than maybe we had been in the past, right? Because we know that we're all adapting on the fly. And again, we have all this stuff going on around us in our home office environments for those of us that are working in that way. So I think that we give each other a little bit more grace in general. Other than that, I think exactly what you said, Olga, is a great tip, right? So just kind of humbling yourself and, saying, apologize and let's get back on track here. If you know you're going to be trying something new, you can let people know before you introduce that. So again, here today, I want to model kind of courage and innovation. And while I've practiced this with my co-presenter, if it doesn't quite work out, we are just going to keep moving forward and maybe come back to this next time. So kind of priming people to know, particularly if there might, you don't have the greatest internet connection, or there might be some type of issue, just framing people, to let them know that this might happen. That can help them be a little bit more forgiving than just expecting that everything is going to go perfectly fine. So that paired with humor, right, and being willing to be vulnerable in the moment, as you just suggested, Olga, when things do go wrong, those are a couple of strategies that can be helpful.
Love it. Love this tip. We'll definitely utilize that. We have a question from Evelyn, who is asking about mini tutorials at the start of the meetings, especially if you're going to be utilizing some of these tools. I do find that helpful. How do you suggest utilizing those?
Yes. So if you have Zoom on their backend portal for meeting setup and webinar setup as well, at the bottom of the left-hand menu, you might have to scroll down. They have a whole host of video tutorials. So if you click on that link, they're really quick too. So they pack a lot into 2 or 3 minutes. I use those frequently when I'm trying out the new features like polling questions and breakout groups. Really great stuff. You can typically also find those and similar tips for other tools on YouTube. So most of these companies will have a YouTube page where they post those tutorial videos as well. So YouTube is a great source, as well as, if you have it, of course, your IT folks or that colleague who has tried these things, right? You can kind of pick their brain in advance for lessons learned as well.
Thank you so much, Angie. Really great response. I do want to share a quick moment of what Atlantic Council does in terms of our tutorials. So last year when we started off doing most of our events virtually, we would send these Zoom best practices, guidelines, and we've stopped doing that a couple of months in because we've noticed that people are getting a hang of Zoom. It was just unnecessary and repetitive. But the things that we still do that I promise you have made our events a lot less stressful and have contributed to events turning out really well is we will do a test run, usually a day or 2 before the event. And I think a lot of people do this. So it's usually 15 to 30 minutes and we run through all the potential trouble that can happen and, go through the best practices there. And then we also do 30-minute green room. Always before each event. And that really helps us with any last minute surprises that, maybe that day off, the internet connection is not great. So you have that 30-minute provides you with plenty of time to fix it. So that's what we do and that's worked for us. My next question for you until we wait for some additional questions from the audience is the actual presentation and using hands or other ways that you can spice up the way you present yourself visually in the little box that you're in this virtual environment. I tend to use hands. I've noticed myself using them closer to my face now because you can see it virtually. Does that help? Is that distracting? Yes or no? And then another way to showcase when you're paying attention and you want to say, yes, I like what you're saying. I feel like, well, I'll just do the nod thing. And it's just, at some point, you just feel like, okay, I'm just nodding. And, what are some other ways to say, yes, I love what you're saying. I agree. That's not just like nodding your head.
So to answer the last question first, the reaction buttons are great for that. So the thumbs up or the clapping, it's like, yeah, I agree, or great point, great comment, right? People intuitively know that that's what those icons mean. So it is important, since that is a newer feature where people might just not realize it's there, to explain in advance where they can find it, right? Similar for the hand raise, if they have a question, that's typically if they have to click on participants and then find the hand raise buttons. The reaction button is typically in the lower panel, right? If they hover over the bottom part of their screen to use those reactions buttons. But I think that's a great tool for signaling to folks that you agree or want to commend them for making a courageous suggestion. And then the first part of your question, can you remind me again what that was, Olga? I apologize.
Hand gesture.
Oh, hands, yes. If things are distracting or helpful, or how to do that. Absolutely. You may have noticed that I use my hands a lot, and I think I do that too much, and that's a holdover from teaching in a physical space, right? So I know that my hand gestures, if I don't monitor them, actually get to the point of a little distracting. So a little bit, right, can be helpful. It does kind of make us feel like we are in more of a shared space and having a normal conversation, but you certainly want to be aware of that, right? Because it does get to the point of being distracting. So just framing up, being mindful to frame up what people are seeing, right? Having your screen close enough. So sometimes people are a little too far back or they're cut off, right? And so that is something that makes people feel distant, right? Or it doesn't feel like we're having authentic conversation, but just being mindful of that kind of nice headshot framing, not too much cluttery stuff going on in the background, and then using occasional hand gestures to provide that kind of authentic feel can help us adapt to this strange new environment that we find ourselves in.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are running out of time. Thank you so much, Angie. Again, this was wonderful and timely, and I hope that all of us are walking away with just a bit more information, a bit more energized, and a bit more tools to reinvigorate our virtual communication. I'd like to thank WCEE staff and WCEE's board for all their hard work in making today's event possible. And we always welcome additional suggestions from our audience on what kind of topic and programming we can do in the future to meet your needs. And if you're interested in getting involved with WCEE, I do encourage you to join our board meeting that's coming up on the 25th at 8:30 in the morning Eastern time. Additionally, there's a couple of other events that I want to make sure that are on your radar. We have a WCEE Virtual Book Club. We'll be hosting an author spotlight with Roger Duncan and Michael Weber. Was book The Future of Buildings, Transportation, and Power, which is on April 7th at 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. Fantastic book, fantastic authors. I hope that you can join us for this. And of course, we are also doing an Earth Day activity, virtual activity day trivia discussions and networking on April 22nd. And you can register for both of these events on the WCEE website. And I also hope that you follow WCEE on Twitter at WCEE_DC. Thank you all. And I hope that you all stay healthy and safe, especially in these challenging times. We look forward to seeing you at other WCEE events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.